By taking some of its market shares with the aid of Brazil and avoiding the European Union with the aid of Iraq, Russia has been able to bypass US sanctions. Putin just shut down all US and EU sanctions against Russia, collapsing the US economy. Despite more restrictions on Moscow's energy supplies, Russian diesel exports experienced their greatest volume ever in the month of March 2023, according to commodities analytics firm Key Player. The United States, Europe, and other Western nations have imposed a number of sanctions on Russia since Vladimir Putin started his war in Ukraine. The import of refined Russian fuels, including diesel, was prohibited by the European Union in February. Russia continues to export large amounts of oil and diesel despite a ban on seaborne crude oil imports in December 2022. In fact, thanks to China and India, crude oil shipments are back above pre-war levels, and in March, Russian diesel exports reached a record 1.27 million barrels per day, according to Kepler data. However, while crude exports have generally concentrated into a small number of significant purchasers, Russian diesel exports have done the reverse. According to Kepler's head oil analyst Matt Smith, trade flows for diesel have increased in many North African nations, while other significant exporters such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia have increased their imports of Russian diesel in recent months due to favorable pricing. He claimed that other countries, such as India and China, have increased their imports of Russian commodities in order to resell them. Overall, he noted that Russian diesel is displacing traditional suppliers as trade flows shift to compensate for the loss of European exports. According to the analyst, it's a game of musical chairs, as we've seen with other Russian exports like fuel oil. Brazil, for example, purchased virtually zero Russian diesel until the end of 2022, with the majority of its supplies coming from the United States and other vendors. The United States shipped nearly 150,000 barrels of diesel per day to Brazil in December 2022, but the figure fell by about 50% in April, according to Kepler data. Meanwhile, Brazil's diesel imports from Russia increased to about 100,000 barrels per day recently. Despite the fact that the United States is a considerably closer trade partner than Russia, implying that Brazil can obtain cheaper supplies despite the longer distance. It may be argued that Brazil is Russia's last port of call when it is unable to sell its diesel to anybody else, but the amounts delivered over the past 3 months point to something more consistent and trend-like. Smith said that Kepler is unaware of the pricing issues, but the facts demonstrate that both Russia's and Brazil's economies are viable. Russian diesel appears to be threatening American diesel's market dominance in Brazil. Russian crude is a loss for Europe. For European oil refiners who were already struggling without long-standing Russian petroleum imports, the loss of comparable supplies from northern Iraq, along with a drastic decrease in production by other key producing nations, worsens the situation. Russia was formerly the largest oil exporter to the European Union, but sanctions have reduced its oil exports by more than 1 million barrels per day since its invasion of Ukraine last February. These reductions are currently the outcome of Iraq's stoppage of exports to Europe via a Turkish port in the Mediterranean Sea. Is Putin's decision actually going to collapse the US economy? Putin just shut down all US and EU sanctions against Russia, collapsing the US economy. OPEC and beyond, including Russia, have declared a supply cut that will begin shortly and lower output by about 1.6 million barrels per day by July. The defeat comes at a difficult time for Europe. The density and sulfur quality of the Russian and Iraqi grades are equivalent, and Asian refiners, particularly those in China, are boosting demand for this so-called medium sour oil, which is a staple in their diet. In the approaching intense competition for barrels, Asia may outbid Europe, leading to European run cuts to stabilize the crude market. Russian imports into Europe declined precipitously in late March. In comparison to almost 1.2 million barrels per day in February of last year, the EU purchased 95,000 barrels of Russian origin in Urals per day. According to Bloomberg statistics, all cargoes were delivered to Bulgaria, which is exempt from EU limitations on seaborne's procurement of Russian crude oil. According to energy considerations, a quarter or more of Europe's imports of Russian oil have been replaced by Middle Eastern oil since the spring of 2022. Flows from Norway and Angola to the United States increased significantly in the first 3 months of this year. In its monthly report earlier this month, the International Energy Agency indicated that there is now a new twist from the Middle East, as about 450,000 barrels per day of petroleum shipments from Iraq's Kurdish region were disrupted last month owing to a payment dispute. Now, according to tanker tracking service records, at least 169,000 barrels of this oil were supplied to the EU per day in March through the Turkish port of Ceyhan. Due to the limits, the market for medium sour crudes is already constricted due to Middle Eastern producers using more of their own oil to improve processing at new domestic refineries. Prices for grades like Iraq's Basra medium, which are generally substantially cheaper than others because of their sulfur concentration, have surged in the Mediterranean to levels that many dealers consider excessively high. Hellenic Petroleum SA, a Greek refiner, also issued the first tender in 2 years to purchase an immediate supply of Basra medium. Some traders speculated that the action signaled the discovery of such barrels in the spot market, despite the loss of Kurdish grades. Russia's Oil Shadow Fleet, a United Nations group that regulates shipping, voiced concern about the shadow fleet of tankers that have arisen to transport oil in the face of sanctions, demanding increased safety precautions. More checks should be carried out in states where ships go dark or turn off their transponders. The International Maritime Organization's legal committee has also opposed ship-to-ship oil transfers into the open ocean, stating that they raise the risk of pollution for coastal states. Countries such as Spain, Australia, the United States and Canada are part of an IMO initiative to improve the regulation of opaque operations in oil trading. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western sanctions hindered shipping routes for the world's most traded commodity. Spain, which has seen an increase in the activity of its North African enclave of Ceuta, has stated that it intends to push for stricter restrictions controlling ship-to-ship oil transfers at the IMO's assembly meeting later this year. The matter is extremely sensitive for the country because it suffered one of the greatest oil spills in European history when a tanker named the Prestige split into half of the country's coast, dumping almost all of its cargo of heavy fuel oil into the sea. While the amount of Russian oil flowing to Asia has increased in recent years, a shadow fleet of thousands of aging ships has developed to enable trade. The panel brought up a 26-year-old tanker named the Turba, which according to Bloomberg had picked up the same cargo of heavy fuel from the same Russian port. The panel claimed that prestige tankers in the dark fleet posed a real and high risk of incident, especially when engaged in ship-to-ship transfers, because they concealed the destinations or origins of the cargo or avoided oversight or regulation by flag or coastal state. The Russian delegation to the IMO urged governments to avoid abusing sanctions and to stop limiting the actions of other states while acknowledging the value of more scrutiny. Russia said that the committee's findings that illegitimate sanctions are to blame for the current worries. Russian crude continues to flow into India and China aboard a vast shadow fleet of tankers that are thought to have been assembled in advance of the price ceiling's implementation, despite the European price cap, which went into force in December 2022, not helping Russian crude supplies to Europe. Historically, ports on the Baltic and Black Seas, as well as a vast network of transcontinental pipeline networks, were used to transport the Urals crude oil grade into Europe. Due to their geographic proximity, the majority of Russian barrels used to end up in European refineries. As a result, Rotterdam set the price for the grade and represented the value that most European refineries saw in it. Since that trade has been replaced by an overflow to India, there have been several market speculations regarding the prices Indian refiners have been paying for the distressed quality shipment in small-sized Aframax tankers. Due to difficulties finding insurance, funding and ships, as well as issues with payments, it is also anticipated that the landed price of these barrels to Indian refiners will fluctuate significantly from the CIF Rotterdam price of crude oil in euros. Click on the subscribe button if you are finding this video interesting. Numerous regulators, both government and non-government, from all over the world are interested in the value of Russian crude oil in order to evaluate the success of efforts to decrease oil revenues. The crude oil trading community has also been closely monitoring this movement since, time and time again, barrels from Russia that have been deeply discounted have presented a serious challenge to barrels from the Middle East, West Africa, and the Atlantic Basin. Market participants have constantly watched the price, which is viewed as a crucial reference point for trading Russian crude oil volumes, especially when the same is done through unconventional supply sources. The flow and economics of this oil will remain a major challenge in India's burgeoning refining industry, which contributes considerably to the expansion in global oil demand. As petroleum consumption grows at a 4.50% annual rate, India's refining capacity is expected to increase from 5.25 million BPD to 5.9 million BPD by 2025. Price assessments not only provide some clarity in the hazy post-invasion world of Russian oil flows, but also serve as a crucial reference point for the broader market, which is touched directly or indirectly by this trade flow realignment. What are your thoughts on the Russian oil sanctions? Want to know more about Saudi Arabia and UAE saved Russia banning oil transport to the US? Watch this video popping on the screen right now to learn more.